Еще одна причина. Так люди стали жить у нас лучше, чем старые люди. Ну и размножаться стали быстрее. Это очень хорошо. Мы это приветствуем, товарищ. Сейчас у нас каждый год чистого прибытка. Население 3 миллиона.
Hidden beneath its polished chrome and tinted glass was a secret. The Soviet public never knew. This was Stalin's personal fortress on wheels, a 5-ton armored beast built for one purpose: survival. Why did the world's most feared dictator need a car so heavily protected? And what secrets did it carry through the shadowy streets of Moscow?
Приятно и радостно знать, что кровь обильно пролитая нашими людьми. Не прошла нам, а дала свои.
After the Second World War, the Soviet Union found itself in a unique position. It had emerged as a superpower, albeit a deeply paranoid one, shaped by years of internal purges, secret police, and the ever-present fear of sabotage and betrayal. At the center of this power structure stood Joseph Stalin, a leader obsessed with control, secrecy, and personal safety. That obsession extended beyond the walls of the Kremlin and into the streets of Moscow, where Stalin's transport had to reflect not only the strength of the state, but also offer the highest level of protection. In the mid to late 1940s, the Soviet government began to focus on developing its own line of heavily armored cars, not just as a practical necessity for protecting its top leadership, but also as a political statement. The Cold War had begun, and showcasing Soviet engineering was part of the broader competition with the West. For Stalin, whose fear of assassination had been well documented, a regular luxury car simply wasn't enough. What he needed was a mobile fortress, one that didn't stand out too much, but could take on any kind of attack, from bullets to grenades. This led to the creation of the ZIS-115, a specially modified version of the standard ZIS-110 limousine. The ZIS, short for Zavod imeni Stalina, literally factory named after Stalin, was based in Moscow and had already been producing high-end government vehicles for some time. The ZIS-110 itself had been inspired by American luxury models of the 1930s and 40s, particularly the Packard Super 8, which had impressed Soviet engineers and politicians alike. That influence carried over into the ZIS-115, though this version would go far beyond looks and comfort. The development of the armored version of the ZIS began around 1948. At first, it was known as the ZIS-110CO, but the project quickly evolved and received a new designation: ZIS-115. This car was never intended for mass production. It was designed with one person in mind: Stalin. That said, the Soviet government ended up producing more than one, as there was always a need to keep the location of the leader unknown, even to his own security detail. Multiple vehicles could be dispatched across different routes, ensuring that potential attackers could never know which one carried the general secretary. Exact production numbers are still debated, but most credible sources agree that between 32 and 56 units were built between 1948 and 1949. Some of these were used by Stalin himself, while others were assigned to other high-ranking officials or kept in reserve. The bodies of the vehicles were assembled at the main ZIS factory in Moscow, while the heavy armor plating and additional modifications were carried out at a specialized facility in Podolsk, just south of the capital. Although the ZIS-115 was based on the standard ZIS-110, the two vehicles were vastly different in terms of their engineering and purpose. The 115 had a completely reinforced body, made using a combination of welded and riveted steel plating. This wasn't just an upgrade in thickness. The entire structure was designed to behave like a protective capsule, with no weak points left to chance. The steel used in its construction was of a type typically reserved for military aircraft, and the weight of the final car reflected this. The ZIS-115 weighed between 4.2 and 5.3 tons, depending on the level of customization. The most visible changes were in the windows. The armored glass was tinted slightly yellow, a unique feature that made the ZIS-115 stand out if you knew what to look for. Each window was more than 4 centimeters thick and could withstand direct gunfire. But this extra protection came at a price. Each window weighed over 200 kilograms, and as a result, the window mechanisms had to be hydraulically operated. Manual cranking simply wasn't an option. These details were kept strictly confidential during the car's production years. Design-wise, the car retained much of the elegance of the original ZIS-110. It had the same large, rounded front grille, elongated body, and chrome accents. However, the ZIS-115 featured larger hubcaps and a third, centrally located fog light, features which hinted at its enhanced nature. There were also additional mounts on the front fenders for small Soviet flags, something rarely seen on regular production cars. But what truly set the ZIS-115 apart was its role as a symbol of state power and paranoia. Stalin rarely, if ever, appeared in public without layers of security, and his relationship with his vehicles reflected that mindset. He frequently changed which car he used, and often had decoy convoys sent out along alternative routes. These tactics weren't just for show. Stalin had survived numerous plots against his life, and his understanding of personal risk was deeply rooted in real events, not just speculation. Interestingly, despite the weight and bulk of the ZIS-115, it was still capable of impressive performance for its time. Fitted with a 6.0-liter straight-8 engine, the car could reach speeds of up to 140 kilometers per hour on open roads, although it's unlikely Stalin ever traveled that fast. The engine was a heavily modified version of the one used in the ZIS-110, reinforced to carry the extra weight without overheating or breaking down. These upgrades were kept in strict secrecy, and only a handful of engineers were allowed to work on the vehicles directly. The interiors of the ZIS-115 were as luxurious as one would expect for a head of state. Thick carpeting, leather seats, and polished wood paneling lined the cabin. The rear seats were typically oversized, designed for comfort during long journeys. However, comfort came second to safety. The roof, floor, and doors were all reinforced with extra layers of armor, and the car's undercarriage was designed to absorb blasts from mines or grenades. It's worth noting that Stalin didn't just use the ZIS-115 for ceremonial purposes. These vehicles were part of his daily routine, transporting him between his residences, government buildings, and secure compounds. Because of that, reliability was absolutely crucial. The cars had to function flawlessly under all weather conditions, often with limited maintenance due to the secrecy surrounding their use. Even within the Kremlin, few people knew the full specifications of Stalin's cars. Most of the vehicles were stored in a secure garage, maintained by a small team of trusted mechanics. They were rarely seen by the public, and photographs of them were strictly controlled. In fact, it wasn't until decades later that detailed images and documents related to the ZIS-115 began to surface, allowing historians to piece together its story. In the years following Stalin's death in 1953, many of the ZIS-115 were quietly decommissioned or repurposed for other Soviet leaders. A few were exported to Allied nations, given as diplomatic gifts to figures such as Mao Zedong and Josip Broz Tito. Today, only a handful remain in museums or private collections. They stand as a rare glimpse into the world of high-level Soviet secrecy and the lengths to which the regime went to protect its leader. The ZIS-115 was based on the civilian ZIS-110, a limousine developed in the late 1940s by the Stalin factory in Moscow. While the ZIS-110 served various state officials and high-ranking party members, the ZIS-115 was a specialized, heavily armored version made in very limited numbers. Only a few dozen were ever produced, and they were reserved for the most senior leadership in the Soviet Union, including Stalin himself. What made the ZIS-115 so unique was not just who it carried, but how it was built. Unlike standard limousines, this car was designed from the start to function like a moving bunker. Every part of it, from the windows to the floor, was reinforced for protection against bullets, explosives, and other forms of attack. While it looked nearly identical to the unarmored ZIS-110 on the outside, its internal structure was completely different. The car's body was constructed using high-strength steel, similar to what was used in military aircraft of the era. This steel was welded and riveted into a continuous protective shell around the passenger compartment. The goal was to eliminate weak points and ensure that, even if the vehicle came under fire or was hit by a mine or grenade, the occupants would be protected. This capsule-like approach to armoring meant that the ZIS-115 was one of the most secure vehicles of its time. One of the most noticeable features was the glass. While regular car windows might be just a few millimeters thick, the ZIS-115 windows were multi-layered and incredibly heavy. Each pane weighed over 200 kilograms and was designed to withstand close-range gunfire. Because of this weight, the windows couldn't be rolled down manually. They were operated hydraulically, a rare and expensive feature at the time, which further highlighted the vehicle's specialized nature. The doors, too, were built with reinforced armor. Each one could weigh several hundred kilograms and needed specially strengthened hinges and supports to function properly. Opening and closing them required more effort than a regular car, and extra hardware was added to ensure the doors didn't swing open accidentally during travel or in the event of an attack. Some reports even suggest safety chains were installed to limit door movement in a crash or explosion. The underbody of the ZIS-115 was no less fortified. It was designed to resist the effects of grenades or small landmines, with thick plating that protected against upward blasts. This was essential, as Stalin's routes between the Kremlin and his other residences were always at risk. His security staff frequently changed travel paths and times to confuse any potential attackers. The car itself needed to be able to survive an unexpected blast from below. Despite all this added weight, over 5 tons in some versions, the ZIS-115 was still expected to move at a decent speed. To accomplish this, engineers modified the engine from the ZIS-110, using a straight 8 6.0-liter engine capable of producing around 140 to 160 horsepower. While this wouldn't make the car fast by today's standards, it was enough to move it efficiently across city roads and highways, especially when accompanied by escort vehicles. The suspension system and chassis were also upgraded to handle the added mass. Reinforcements ensured that the weight of the armor wouldn't cause long-term stress damage to the vehicle's frame. The tires, often overlooked in discussions about armored cars, were designed to support extreme loads and featured run-flat capabilities. This meant that even if they were punctured, the car could continue driving for a significant distance, potentially long enough to escape an ambush. Inside the vehicle, the ZIS-115 maintained the luxury expected of a head-of-state car. The seats were upholstered in leather or high-quality cloth, and the cabin featured wood trim, thick carpets, and polished metal details. Despite the car's massive structure, the interior remained quiet and comfortable, largely because of the thickness of the materials used. The windows also reduced external noise, creating an insulated space for the occupants. However, the ZIS-115 was never about comfort alone. Every design choice pointed back to the same priority: safety. Even the rear seats were positioned carefully, allowing Stalin or other passengers to sit in the most protected section of the vehicle. Communication equipment may have been included, although specifics about interior electronics remain less documented due to the secretive nature of the Soviet state. The car's role extended far beyond simply moving people from point A to B. In Stalin's case, it was part of a daily strategy of avoiding detection. He never used the same route twice in a row, and rarely rode in the same car 2 days running. Multiple ZIS-115 vehicles would sometimes be dispatched at once, each with identical appearances, to further confuse would-be attackers. Only Stalin and a handful of his closest security personnel knew which car he would actually ride in. From the outside, very few people knew how to spot the difference between a ZIS-110 and a ZIS-115, but the subtle differences were there. Apart from the central fog light and tinted windows, The armored model featured stronger axles and brake systems, thicker fenders, and sometimes even reinforced bumpers. These adjustments were necessary to handle the car's increased mass, but they were also done in a way that wouldn't draw attention to the vehicle's true nature. The production of the ZIS-115 was handled with absolute secrecy. Only select engineers and technicians were permitted to work on the cars. Each unit took months to complete, and quality control was strict. The armoring was done separately from the general assembly process, with special equipment used to test the integrity of the steel plating and glass. After final assembly, each vehicle was thoroughly inspected and tested under various conditions. Once in use, the vehicles were maintained by a dedicated team of state mechanics. These technicians were responsible not only for upkeep, but for keeping the cars operational in extreme climates, cold winters, hot summers, and anything in between. Most of these cars were stored in secure garages and kept away from public view. In fact, the general population wasn't even aware of the ZIS-115's existence for decades. This armored limousine was designed to transport the leader of the Soviet Union in complete safety, without drawing attention or revealing its defensive capabilities to casual observers. But underneath its stately appearance, the ZIS-115 was a machine with specialized technical features built to keep Stalin alive, even in the face of extreme threats. To start with, the powertrain of the ZIS-115 had to be significantly more robust than that of the standard ZIS-110. The car's base engine was a 6.0-liter inline 8-cylinder, capable of producing somewhere between 140 and 162 horsepower. On paper, that might not seem particularly powerful, especially when compared to modern cars. But in the context of the late 1940s and early 1950s, it was a considerable output, especially when matched to the kind of drivetrain required to move a car that weighed over 5 tons. This engine had to do a lot of work. The ZIS-115's reinforced body and bulletproof features meant the total vehicle weight was far beyond what most cars at the time were expected to carry. The engine was modified to offer higher torque and better low-end power, so the car could accelerate smoothly, despite its bulk. It wasn't designed for racing, but for strength and reliability. To support the engine, the transmission system had to be just as strong. A heavy-duty 3-speed manual gearbox was used, one capable of managing the constant strain of propelling such a massive body. The clutch and gearbox components were reinforced, and the gear ratios were adapted for better low-speed performance. This allowed the ZIS-115 to move steadily through Moscow's streets without overheating or stalling. Top speed varied depending on the final build and the amount of additional equipment installed. On average, the ZIS-115 could reach speeds of up to 120 kilometers per hour, although it rarely did so. The most important requirement was not how fast it could go, but how smoothly and reliably it could operate over long distances and in varying conditions. Whether it was crossing icy roads in winter or moving between secure compounds in the height of summer, the car had to function flawlessly. The suspension system was another critical area that needed to be rethought. The massive weight of the vehicle meant that a conventional setup would wear out quickly or lead to an uncomfortable ride. So the engineers at the Stalin factory developed a reinforced independent front suspension with coil springs, while the rear used semi-elliptical leaf springs. This combination offered a balance between durability and comfort, though the ride was naturally stiffer than a standard limousine. Braking was another challenge. Stopping a vehicle that heavy, especially in emergency situations, required more than regular drum brakes. The ZIS-115 featured a vacuum-assisted braking system, which was quite advanced for the time. This allowed the driver to stop the vehicle more quickly and safely, even if fully loaded or moving at higher speed. The brakes were checked regularly, often before and after every journey, as part of strict maintenance protocols. Tires were designed to be extra thick and reinforced. In some cases, run-flat tire technology was used, allowing the car to keep moving even after sustaining damage. These tires were custom-made and could carry the extreme weight of the vehicle without failing. Because each wheel weighed far more than those on standard cars, changing them required special tools and trained personnel. It wasn't something that could be done by the side of the road. The fuel system also had to match the demands of the vehicle. With an engine that large and a body that heavy, fuel consumption was high. The ZIS-115's fuel tank held enough to give it a range suitable for long-distance travel without frequent stops. However, no exact figure was made public at the time, for security reasons. What is known is that the car was rarely driven beyond secure perimeters, without a support convoy, which included fuel and spare parts if needed. But the ZIS-115 wasn't just a technical achievement, it was part of a broader security strategy. Stalin himself was extremely cautious and suspicious. He often changed his travel routes at the last minute, used decoy convoys, and would never confirm his destination to anyone except a small circle of guards and drivers. Sometimes multiple identical vehicles were sent out at once, each following a different route, to confuse any potential attackers. Stalin never used the same car 2 days in a row. His motor pool contained several ZIS-115, all in nearly identical condition. Drivers were rotated, and even they weren't told which car Stalin would be riding in until just before departure. This level of operational secrecy extended to every detail of the car's use. Mechanics who worked on the vehicles were sworn to silence. Parking locations were classified. Even photographs of the car were rare and tightly controlled. Inside the vehicle, the rear passenger compartment was designed for comfort and privacy. The rear seats were spacious and well padded, often covered in leather or high-end cloth. Stalin would sit slightly reclined, often reading documents or smoking during transit. The soundproofing of the car, thanks to its thick materials, made it extremely quiet inside, isolating the passengers from outside noise. There were also curtains for the windows, which were usually drawn during travel to prevent visibility from outside. Some versions of the ZIS-115 reportedly included telephone equipment or radio communication systems, allowing Stalin to stay in contact with the Kremlin or other locations while in transit. These systems would have been hardwired and operated by a separate power supply to avoid interception or signal failure. Again, details are scarce, but it's likely that a high level of internal communication ability was considered essential. The vehicles were serviced in a secure compound by a trusted team of engineers. Maintenance was constant. After each trip, the car would be inspected for damage, mechanical faults, or any signs of tampering. Fuel tanks were checked for sabotage, and electrical systems were tested thoroughly. The margin for error was zero. A failure in any component could lead to disastrous consequences. Stalin's use of the ZIS-115 was not ceremonial. Unlike modern heads of state, who might be seen publicly stepping in or out of their cars, Stalin was rarely photographed near his vehicle. The ZIS-115 was not about appearances, it was about protection. It allowed Stalin to travel without fear, at least within the limits that paranoia allowed. It also enabled the Soviet government to maintain an image of invulnerability, projecting power through invisible means. Over time, as technology advanced and leadership changed, the ZIS-115 was eventually retired from frontline use. But for a number of years, it remained the standard bearer of Soviet executive protection. Even after Stalin's death, the vehicles continued in service under other leaders, though by the 1980s, most had been replaced or decommissioned. The ZIS-115 wasn't built to be a temporary solution. Its design, materials, and engineering reflected long-term thinking. It was not just a tool for Stalin's personal safety, but a vehicle intended to last. After Stalin's death, the Soviet Union found itself in a strange position. His legacy was already controversial within political circles, and his name was slowly being erased from public institutions. Yet the tools and infrastructure that supported his rule, including the ZIS-115, still had a role to play. The limousine's usefulness hadn't vanished with its original passenger. Its durability and performance, especially in terms of armor and reliability, remained unmatched in the Soviet fleet. For this reason, many of the remaining ZIS-115 vehicles were reassigned to other high-ranking officials. While they may no longer have carried the leader of the Soviet Union, they still transported ministers, military generals, and heads of regional governments. In the highly secretive and controlled political environment of the Cold War, it made sense to continue using vehicles that had already proven their capability. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, the ZIS-115 remained operational in very limited numbers. As new vehicles like the ZIS-111 and later ZIS-114 entered production, the armored ZIS began to fade into the background. These newer models incorporated more modern design, updated technologies, and improved comfort. But even then, the ZIS-115 wasn't completely phased out. In fact, it continued to play a behind-the-scenes role in Soviet security well into the 1970s. Some of the cars were held in reserve, kept in underground or heavily guarded government garages, and only used during periods of heightened security or as backup vehicles. Others were sent abroad, not as exports, but as diplomatic gifts to leaders of allied communist nations. Among those who received ZIS-115 Limo were Mao Zedong in China and Josip Broz Tito in Yugoslavia. For the Soviet Union, gifting such a vehicle was more than an act of generosity. It was a show of strength and technological pride. In some cases, the cars were even reverse-engineered or used as references for local production. Chinese manufacturers, for example, studied the vehicle closely, and elements of the ZIS-115 design would later appear in Chinese state cars. These transfers reinforced the vehicle's place not just as a part of Soviet history, but as a symbol of international influence within the Eastern Bloc. And as time passed and the Cold War began to evolve, the remaining ZIS-115s became harder to spot. Most were quietly retired. Some were dismantled, stripped of their components, and scrapped. Others were sent to government storage facilities, where they would remain untouched for decades. A few were simply forgotten, left in garages or basements of regional ministries, their history unknown to those who eventually found them. In the 1980s, as the Soviet government began looking at options for modernizing its fleet of executive vehicles, the ZIS-115 was revisited, not for use, but for research. Engineers working on new generations of armored limousines reportedly used decommissioned ZIS-115s in crash tests. These tests showed just how well built the vehicles were. Even decades after their manufacture, the armored shell of the ZIS-115 held up under stress, proving its value as a blueprint for future protection technologies. By the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a few surviving examples of the ZIS-115 began to appear in public collections and private hands. For years, the existence of the vehicle had been classified or simply unknown to the general public. Now, museums and collectors were starting to take notice. The combination of historical significance, limited production, and Cold War mystery gave the car a new kind of value, cultural and historical, rather than political. Today, only a small number of ZIS-115s are known to exist. Some are displayed in Russian automotive museums, such as those in Moscow and St. Petersburg, while others are found in foreign institutions, in countries that once had close ties with the Soviet Union. These cars are typically kept in pristine condition, restored to their original appearance, and sometimes even made roadworthy again. In some rare cases, private collectors have managed to acquire them at auctions or through former state channels. What makes the ZIS-115 so captivating to modern audiences is not just its design or engineering, but what it represents. This was not just a car, it was a manifestation of one of the most secretive and security-obsessed regimes in history. Every part of the vehicle tells a story. From the hydraulically powered windows to the reinforced steel floor, from the deep tinted glass to the hidden communications equipment, the car was built to protect a man who trusted very few people and feared many more. It also represents a moment in time when the Soviet Union placed great emphasis on symbolism. A leader's car wasn't just transportation, it was a rolling symbol of control, power, and technological achievement. The ZIS-115 fit that purpose perfectly. It was meant to project the message that the Soviet leadership was untouchable, that no threat could penetrate their armor, literally or figuratively. At the same time, the car also speaks to the fear and isolation at the top of that system. Stalin's need for such a vehicle reflected his constant fear of assassination, his obsession with security, and his belief that even the smallest detail could be a matter of life or death. The fact that he never drove the same car twice in a row, never took the same route, and kept the car's location secret from even his closest advisors, shows just how much importance he placed on the idea of invincibility. From an engineering perspective, the ZIS-115 is an example of how political pressure can push the limits of design. It was never intended to be sold, exported commercially, or mass-produced. As a result, it was free from many of the constraints that regular consumer cars face. Cost was no issue, production time was not a major factor, and its only job was to be the best possible solution to one man's fear of being killed. As years go by, and more people learn about the ZIS-115, its place in history continues to grow. It serves as a reminder of a unique period when automobiles weren't just about luxury, convenience, or performance. They were about ideology, secrecy, and survival. The ZIS-115, more than perhaps any other car from its era, embodies all of those ideas in metal, glass, and rubber. The few that remain today aren't just rare vehicles, they are relics of a political climate that shaped the modern world. Whether behind museum ropes or restored to operational condition, they continue to attract the interest of historians, car enthusiasts, and people fascinated by the Cold War era. For a car that was once hidden from the public eye, it has found a new life, not as a tool of secrecy, but as a window into the past.